All right, thank you guys and welcome to a little College beer tasting. It's Oktoberfest season, so why not hang out here at a German brewery and get ourselves a little bit of culture, right? So we're going to enjoy a spot of Gemütlichkeit, and I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm going to wander around. This is interactive, so go ahead and ask questions if you want, or pipe in as we work our way through a little tour of Bavaria and German beer drinking. So. April and the crew are starting to bring a few glasses in, and as we do that, we're going to go through just a little bit of background to get ourselves started. I think everybody kind of knows me a little bit, but there's a little blurb up front. And if you haven't, has everybody been to the brewery before? I know you have. Everybody's been here before? You guys have not been here before? You have? Okay, cool. Well, you got to bring Claire, goodness sakes. And Jake has not been here before, so that's awesome. And I know Gracie's been here. So we are a German-based brewery, if you hadn't figured that out a little bit. In fact, for those of you who are native Grand Rapidians, if you look around the walls here, these are the old hand-painted panels from the Schnitzelbank restaurant, which was a three-generation restaurant in downtown Grand Rapids that existed from 1933 or so, 38, somewhere in there, and it was until 2006. So we were able to kind of salvage these panels and fit perfectly in our little side room for special events such as this. I don't know as if there's really another German restaurant hanging around in Grand Rapids nowadays, so it's kind of cool that we do get some people that come here for the food too, which is really kind of weird because we really did this with beer in mind, and we're going to get into some of that a little bit today. One of the things that we kind of deal with here at Cedar Springs is most of the craft beer boom is really based on English style tradition. So a lot of people are used to seeing a bunch of IPAs out there and stouts and porters and all that kind of things, which are beautiful and wonderful things. And then we get Belgian styles and nowadays some fruit beers and sours and all kinds of stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of what we get as German beer isn't always the freshest examples in the world, as they're imports, and they, by and large, come from the big guys. In fact, the Munich Big Six, which are kind of the famous ones from Oktoberfest, 4 of the 6 are no longer even owned by Germans. 2 of them are owned by Heineken, and 2 of them are owned by Anheuser-Busch InBev. So, they're big breweries. They make world-class beer, obviously, but much like the United States, some of the interesting and creative stuff is made by the little guys, and we've kind of emulated a few of those with some of the things that we do. People think of Germany, most of the time when they're thinking of Germany, what they're really thinking of is Bavaria. When you think of people in the Lederhosen and the Dindels and the big Maßkrug and the beer halls and the big festivals and all that stuff, that's not really German. In fact, if you go to the north, they don't want to have anything to do with all that stuff. That's goofy stuff from the south. Bavaria was the last state to come into the Greater German Union, not till 1871. And most people from Bavaria think of themselves as Bavarians first, kind of like maybe Texans or Californians around here, and Germans second, and coincidentally, most of the rest of Germany thinks of them as Bavarians first and Germans second. But they've really kept hard with their culture, and most of what we think of, and Frankenmuth on the other side of the state as Michigan's Little Bavaria, that's really all based on kind of Bavarian shtick. So we're talking about the South, centered around Munich, the southern area of Germany. And after most of us that went to K College, almost all of us, we were all exchange students. We all went somewhere, and I couldn't get enough, so I went back. So I spent a number of years after K back in Germany with some connections that I had made while I was living over there, and I had a chance to work, got a job, they put me to work, and I was a crazy foreign guy, and I ended up getting into the brewing world and started almost with, I had an idea of importing originally, but I was told by a brewer that was stupid, make it yourself. And he had a point. So I got into the apprenticeship program over there and started working in breweries, and got my own pair of rubber boots, and there's another story to that entirely. But they also thought it was very interesting in the land of pisswater that someone wanted to end up making real beer. And For those of us who are Hornets, we know that there's quite a few of us that have fallen into that category. Obviously, Larry Bell is in that category. Three Blondes is down by South Haven, is K College peeps. Matt and Renee Greff that own Arbor Brewing Company are K College folks. Scott Graham is the current executive director of the Michigan Brewers Guild, is a K College guy. So there's quite a few Hornets that maybe some of that travel rubbed off on us a little bit, and we enjoyed that culture that we ended up getting into that world a little bit. So coming back here, I started poking around. I was as a history guy at K, the whole going to law school thing never stuck. I started doing a lot of research on the brewing history here in West Michigan. And there were 9 breweries by the end of the Civil War that were here in the West Michigan area, and all of them were actually German. That was kind of ironic because the very first brewery known that was in 1836 was an Englishman by the name of George Pennell, but he didn't really last very long. He was followed shortly thereafter by this gentleman, Christoph Kuster. And he showed up by the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald region, came through Ann Arbor and ended up here in West Michigan. And he was a professional brewer. He partnered up with Pennell and very quickly bought him out. And Pennell got into another business and really wasn't heard from a whole lot after that. But Christoph started and founded then a pretty successful business. And it was downtown, if you're in Grand Rapids, downtown on the Michigan Hill right below Spectrum Hospital. In fact, there's a big Gothic church that sits downtown as you're going up the hill. It's kind of a sandstone brown Gothic church, and that he was a founding member of that church. That was the Lutheran church in 1857. But he had built a little German brewery that plugged along for a number of years. And unfortunately, it was known as City Brewery, but unfortunately in 1880 he was lost on the sinking of the steamer Alpina. And that was actually just the anniversary was just a week ago, October 16th. And that's still the largest known civilian loss of life on Lake Michigan. He went down, unfortunately his body was never found. But there was 80 or so folks that were lost on that. And in fact, any of you that are familiar with the Muskegon area, there's a beach north of there called Alpena Beach. And people think that that's named for the town up north. And actually that was named for that shipwreck. That's where most of it washed ashore. But his sons, Charles and Frederick, then took over the brewery, and that was renamed C. Kuster and Sons. And they moved forward. And they were really, as I mentioned, by the eve of after the Civil War, there were 9 breweries total here in the West Michigan area, but they really remained the largest and most prominent brewery in the area. And none of them, however, really emerged, and they started to see outside competition from beyond Grand Rapids. You had Chicago brewers and Detroit brewers and others that were starting to come into the market here. And Christoph, the Kusterer family then merged with 5 other German brewers, so 6 total, to form the original Grand Rapids Brewing Company in 1892. And then they rebuilt a new brewery on the site of the Kusterer Brewery in 1893. And that's the one that a lot of people maybe have seen the murals of that existed, again, on the hill downtown just below that Lutheran church. That actually, by the eve of Prohibition, ended up being enormous. They had a capacity close to 600,000 barrels, which is about the size of Founders today. I mean, that's a pretty good size brewery, especially for its era. And in fact, across what was Michigan Street now, where 196 came through, was the site of the stables and the fermentation cellars. They had 150 50-barrel fermenters made out of California cypress wood that was on that site. And of course they had horses and for delivering in those days prior to Prohibition, the breweries owned a lot of the bars and the restaurants, much like you might find in Europe. And so they were delivering, of course, their product throughout the area to the different saloons and restaurants. Grand Rapids Brewing Company survived up until the eve of Prohibition. Michigan went dry before the rest of the country, which is kind of where Al Capone got his start, actually on the Detroit River, and that's what gave rise to a lot of the Canadian distilleries shipping spirits and libations across the river. But the family then divested, the Kusterer family divested. They were no longer using the Kusterer name, obviously, when the Grand Rapids Brewing Company was formed. And they divested and kind of got out of the industry. The building then was reformed after Prohibition as the Michigan Brewing Company, and that lasted just for a couple of years, and then it was purchased by Fox Deluxe out of Chicago, and some old-timers in West Michigan will still remember Fox Deluxe beer. That lasted up until 1951, and then the building was torn down in 1958 during urban renewal. Grand Rapids Brewing Company was reformed after Prohibition in Muskegon, on the site of the Muskegon Brewing Company, and you'll still see some of those bottles hanging around nowadays. And then that lasted until the 40s and was out, and then Grand Rapids Brewing Company was reborn, the third version, on 28th Street out in Kalamazoo, or excuse me, out in Grand Rapids by the Sheldys Corporation, and that was a brew pub, so it was a little bit more of a restaurant. That lasted about 15 years. That was the second brew pub in Michigan, actually, once the laws changed to allow them. And then was formed again downtown, and that's owned by the Hopcat Group, Sellers Group, Barfly Ventures, and that is also a brew pub that exists downtown. So that's actually Grand Rapids Brewing Company number 4. So, anybody remember Fox Deluxe, or hearing maybe parents talk about it if you were from the area at all? No? Find some cans around that a little bit nowadays. So, all right, so there's a little background there, and now let's get into tasting some beer. When we taste beer, we're going to kind of go through this as a process a little bit, but a couple of steps to doing this, and hopefully everybody's got clean hands. We should all be washing our hands nowadays. But grab your darker beer first, okay? But as you do this and you get ready to taste, the first thing we do is a little bit of a flyby. So you're just going to get a little bit of aroma as you run around, as you run this past. And you kind of know, you're going to get a little hint, hopefully, of that, of the smells off of that. But your nose kind of adjusts a little bit, kind of like when you walk in the house and grandma's been baking cookies, but if you hang around a little bit, you notice it, and if you leave the house and you come back in, you're like, whoa, there's those cookies again, or the fresh baked bread. Your olfactory senses will start to get used to this. So you're going to get a little sensory from doing that. So once you readjust, you can come back then, and some people either like a number like a puppy dog, real deep, real quick sniffs, or nice and deep and draw that all the way in. And you can swirl it around a little bit to perk up the aromas. Is there any smells anybody's getting off of that? Can you pick anything up? Little banana? Right, that's the first thing most people will taste. And so then you can take a little sip, roll it around a bit, and exhale through your nose. You probably really get the banana now. Kind of a nutty banana nut bread flavor a little bit. So we're tasting beers here by our Kusterer beers by Cedar Springs. So these are our German or Bavarian inspired beers. This beer actually goes back to 500-600-year-old recipes. This is actually Hefeweizen or Weissbier or wheat beer or Weizenbier. Those are all interchangeable terms. But this was the traditional style that evolved coming through the Black Forest region in Bohemia and in northern Bavaria about 500-600 years ago, originally in the Schwarzach region. You guys may have heard of the Reinheitsgebot. You ever heard of the German Bier purity law? Okay, so that is 504 years old now, and that was based on a Munich law prior by the Wittelsbachs. They extended this to all of Bavaria, and it dictated, at the time, quality and price, etc. on beer, but it also dictated ingredients. And in those days, they only allowed malted barley, water, and hops in beer. They granted one exception to the Degensberger family, who were some local lords in the Schwarzach region, to use wheat. And they quickly realized that they had made a mistake, because they had just granted a monopoly. And a royal decree once issued, you can't really pull this back. So this led to a several generation tax dispute, if you will, because the Degensbergers suddenly had a money-making machine. They were the only ones allowed to use wheat, and for all others, wheat had to be preserved for bakers and farmers to provide bread for the people. This led to a tax dispute, as I mentioned, for several generations. And unfortunately for the Degensbergers, their patriarch made the fatal mistake of dying without an heir. I forget his name, Sigmund, I believe, Sigmund IV. Passed away and had not created an heir at that point, and so his rights passed to the Wittelsbachs. So the Wittelsbachs, the royal family of Bavaria, who at that time had been campaigning against wheat beer, suddenly thought wheat beer was a pretty cool idea. So for almost 300 years, the rights to make this beer were exclusive to the royal brewer, the royal crown, and it was up to a third of royal revenues. So if you can imagine the United States running itself 1/3 on the sales of a beer, that's essentially what happened for almost 300 years. In fact, they fought the 30 Years' War against the Swedes on the sale of Weissbier, which is kind of funny now because Matt, our head brewer is Matt Peterson, who's a Swedish guy. So we can drink a beer and still talk about the old times, you know. But that ended up being a good moneymaker for them for a long time. So hold this thought. We're going to get into a little German history beyond that as we get into lager beers. But suffice to say, because people couldn't make this, other styles evolved, and by the mid to late 19th century, wheat beer started to fade away as a style. One of the brewers, a gentleman by the name of George Schneider, was granted permission by the king to start making wheat beer, and really for the next 100 years he was about the only ones that made this style, okay? And it wasn't until the 1960s when we get into the pale beer in front of you. But real quick, any thoughts on this one? Have you had a chance to try this beer before? I know some of you have, of course. So, you get a little bit of the banana nut bread flavor to it. Pairs great with food. It's not a coincidence that German food really evolved with a lot of these styles, so that pairs up very, very well. But if you think of things we think of as German foods, sausages and schnitzels and cheese, spätzle, cheese noodles, I mean, a lot of those real savory foods go very, very nicely with this kind of beer.
Did you find it difficult to try to duplicate the flavor? Because when I first tried this, I thought this was very authentic. Right. With our ingredients here in the U.S.
Right. Actually, we import grain for this. Unfortunately, in the U.S., we use a lot of American hops and malt as well in a lot of our Cedar Springs line. But for our German line, the flavor profiles are just different. So we can't, especially with the hops, which is really unfortunate. A lot of those noble varieties, if you grow them here because of the climate and the soils here, they end up taking on aromatic characteristics and they taste more like an IPA or something. So. We actually do import most of the ingredients and the yeast for these beers. But yeah, this is a somewhat unusual style to make. We use open fermentation, and it's a specialty yeast to create these, and we do step mashing, which gets into some brew geek stuff in the brew house to bring a little bit more of these malty flavors out. You'll notice in a lot of these beers, the flavors are driven by the malt or the body of the beer. You're not getting hit in the head with a 2x4 in terms of hops. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I love a great hoppy IPA too, but these flavors are a lot more subtle. So, okay.
David, did you have to get approval from anybody, or is it now just a free-for-all? You can make.
No, for Weissbier? Yeah. Anybody can make Weissbier now. It's no longer exclusive, and even then, that would be in Germany, of course, not necessarily in the U.S. But there's no trade restriction on it. I mean, a lot of breweries make a version of Hefeweizen or Weissbier or Weizenbier. As I said, those are all interchangeable terms. Most Americans say Hefeweizen. Germans understand it's Hefe because Hefe means yeast, and all Weissbiers are unfiltered except for a Cristal. But otherwise, they're always unfiltered, so it's understood you're going to have the Hefe in there. And that was really done as a marketing term. As we get into this next beer here, and I should say, this is kind of our flagship beer. This has won a ton of international and national awards locally here. Best of the West, I think 4 years running now, has been the best German beer in West Michigan. Twice in the World Beer Awards in London, which has been very nice. Great American Beer Festival and a handful of others. So it's been kind of rewarding to get this one out here, and it's a style that not very many people are familiar with, so kind of cool.
You said that the recipe was hundreds of years old?
Well, it really was. The style evolved hundreds of years ago, but when people think of Hefeweizen, they don't usually think of something that's dark. They think of the lighter one that's in front of you, which we'll get to in just a second. But this was traditionally the way it was made. Schneiderweiss is the one that you can get in the U.S. There's a handful of others. There's maybe a dozen small Bavarian breweries that still make this style, but even in Bavaria, it's relatively rare. Most of them are making the pale modern version of Weiss beer. But the brewery that I worked in, which you saw the bad picture earlier with the bad haircut and the Yesterdog t-shirt, the brewery that I worked in made this style, and I mean, I just fell in love with the style, and I'm like, why don't we have this?
So did you develop the recipe based off that?
Yeah, it was just kind of based off of that. And then we regularly take our crew over, so our brewing team's been over 3 times, and our kitchen staff has been over twice to train. So we'll go over there and spend a week or 2, and we'll work in the breweries or work in kitchens to work on a lot of this stuff and make sure that we got to do quality control while we're there, of course, but making sure that we're hitting the profiles and staying on top of the techniques. So like I said, most people think of this pale version as Hefeweizen or Weiss beer. And a lot of people think of this as an old traditional Bavarian beer, but actually this style was invented in 1965. It's not that old, really. And for most of us, we think of 1965 as not that long ago, but actually from most of my staff, I understand that is a long time ago. So, but this is kind of what people think of, and a lot of Americans especially think of this as a summery beer. So if we stick our nose in this, and we can kind of do the same little exercise, you might get even a little more floral out of this, a little more fruitiness, probably a little more banana, maybe even a touch of clove, our common flavors. A little lighter in body, obviously, than the other. It's a little lower in alcohol, and a touch fruitier. When I first moved over and was living in Germany, actually, I didn't like Weiss beer at all. It was hazy and cloudy and looked funny, and I said, "Oh, there's bird poop in the bottom of it. Why is it cloudy?" And that's the reason for the Kristallweizen. By the time Weiss beer was reintroduced to the market, everybody was used to lager beers. They were used to these clean, crisp lager beer. That's what we think of a lot of times as German beer, and really the style of beer that most American beers eventually were based on. And as a marketing term, they would filter this, and some people learned to drink it with a lemon in it as well. The citric acids, kind of like when you're drinking a Corona, those citric acids will cut those phenolic aromas and make it seem a little bit more like a lager beer. So it was a way really to kind of market a beer that people weren't used to. Now, Weiss beer is about 25% of the Bavarian market. So Helles is still the top selling beer, which is just your pale lager. But this is a very popular style throughout Bavaria. And then other areas and regions certainly have made some versions of it. But when we're talking about Weiss beer, we're talking about that Bavarian style. It's at least 51% malted wheat, okay? And it has this specialty yeast that gives you like these nice banana clovey flavors to it, okay? Has anybody, I assume people have kind of tried this style of beer before. Have you had Hefeweizens from other breweries? So some of the big ones that we get here as an import, Hacker Shore, Paulaner, Erdinger, Weinstephaner are a lot of the big breweries that will export their version of Hefeweizen or Weiss beer to the U.S. So we have 2 more Weiss beers coming, but the pale one is 5% ABV, and the original is 5.5. So these are all very drinkable beers. One of the cool things about German beers, I mean, one of the keys to German beer is it's 4 ingredients. It's malt, water, hops, and what they didn't know when they originally created the Reinheitsgebot was yeast. It was 80 years later before Louis Pasteur discovered that that's what actually made the beer bubble. People, people think he was, creating penicillin and all that. He was actually doing research on beer. He was trying to figure out what made the beer bubble, and that it was yeast ultimately. So that had to be added to the Reinheitsgebot to allow you to create beer. But the wheat, as long as it was malted, was then allowed as an exception to the Reinheitsgebot as the Wittelsbach moved forward and marketed wheat beer as now a good and healthy thing versus campaigning against it prior to that. And it was very popular because it was nice and light and bubbly, where in that time Munich was very dark, was very hard water, and a lot of the beers were very dark, heavy beers. Munich was really known for dark beer initially. Later on that changed, but up front and prior to the late 19th century, Munich was always known for dark beers. This was a nice alternative to that, much easier to drink. So,
Do you use the same yeast for all your wheat beers?
all of our Weiss beers do use the same yeast. We get about 6 to 7 generations, and we have changed yeast labs a couple of times based on what we're getting. It's a living organism, so the treatment and the care that you take on your yeast obviously is paramount to the quality of the product you're going to get on the other end. Early on, we figured out the limit. I think we went 8 generations, and we ended up having a beer that went on us because it'll mutate. It's a very flocculent yeast that mutates, and it will change. It's a living organism, again, as it goes through its generations. And we ended up having a batch we had to dump, and then we got a better idea. We decided to distill it instead. So after that, we had a purpose for it. But originally, when it was like, this isn't right, we can't serve it. So that's what we had to do. But yeah, we get all of our yeast then from a lab. So, and Jake, your question again was?
Yeah. So all of the Kuster beers use imported ingredients from Germany?
Yeah, we're really pursuing as authentic of a flavor as we possibly can. A lot of times with beer geeks in particular, and they're used to a lot of great big beers, and they say, oh, German beer is boring. Well, our rebuttal to that is maybe you haven't had a fresh German beer. And really these beers are designed, as we talked about with the ABV, these are not big, heavy beers. And you can sit and look for these subtle flavors, as these first two we're finding a little bit of nuttiness and a little bit of banana or clove. But you can also just sit around. These are drinkable beers. You can just sit around with friends and isn't this great, and not really think too much about, all the flavors that you're in there. I mean, sipping beer is a social sport. It's meant to be social. If you think about German beer halls, for those of you that were on K that traveled on your Eurail pass and went down to Germany and hung out in the beer halls, that's what you did. You all sat around these big tables and you made new friends, and next thing you know, you're clinking glasses. And it's really meant to be a social sport like that. And obviously beer can be a social lubricant. So it doesn't have to be complex, but those subtle and balanced flavors are there if you really want to dig in or pair these things up with food without overwhelming the food. So.
Dave, what would you say the ABVs are on these two?
The pale one is 5%, and the original is 5.5%. So, range for Weiss beers tends to be about 4.8 to 5.5. So it's right in the range with what you might typically see. Okay. So our next round that's coming out here then is the Dunkelweizen, and as you might imagine, this is a dark wheat. Okay. So this evolved when the pale malting technology, which the reason the early Weiss beers looked like this is they couldn't make pale malt. The technology didn't exist. By the time wheat beer was relaunched later on in the 60s, they were able to make the pale malt, and they were able to make these much lighter, more delicate flavors. And at the same time, they learned that if they roasted the malt a little bit longer, they could get a little bit more of a chocolatey flavor out of this. And as we go through our exercise with our Kuster Dunkelweizen, does everybody have this one yet? Everybody have the Dunkelweizen? Okay. Rob, you're doing good, I think, because you've knocked them all out. It's your professionalism that I admire. So, but this one, you're going to get some of those same light fruity esters. But as you sip this is going to have a little more body and almost a milk chocolatey banana flavor to this one. So when I'm in Germany, and not a lot of places make the original style. There's a few breweries that do, but my go-to is kind of the Dunkelweizen, because you can find that everywhere. The pale Weiss beer and the Dunkelweizen you can find everywhere. I like the pale, but it gets a little too sweet for me if I drink too much of it. So, what does anybody think of this one, though? You had a chance to taste it? And again, heavier foods this will go with. So beef is now starting to become popular in Bavaria again. Along with, ironically, vegetarian dishes. When I was living over there, you could never find vegetarian food. And now, suddenly, you're finding vegetarian food and vegan food everywhere in Germany, the land of meat and potatoes. So it's kind of nice. And really, these darker ones actually pair up very, very nicely with a lot of that lighter fare. So it's kind of a peanut butter and jelly type of thing, a little contrast. Okay? So you're going to have a different logo on your next glass as that's coming in. This is the Weizen Bock. Now, Bock beer in general, most people have heard that term before, and a lot of times if you ever see any beers that are producing Bock, they always have a billy goat, which is the German word for goat, is Bock. So they'll use a billy goat as the logo to that. And these really were initially developed in the Einbeck region, which is in the north, And we're going to talk about Einbeck again a little bit later on. But those usually were lager beers. They kind of evolved during the rise of lager beer and as more and more people were drinking lager. But in 1904, the Schneider guys that we talked about earlier as kind of the ones that saved wheat beer as a style, they picked up and made, all they make is wheat beer. So they made a Weizenbock, a strong version of Bock beer. And the beer geeks usually will go crazy over Aventinus, which is the Schneider Weiss version of Bock beer. So that's a little stronger version. This is about, I think, a touch over 7%. So it's a ninja beer because it'll sneak up on you. You won't taste it at all. If you go through the same exercise again, we're going to get a little more body of this, and you might catch a little more raisin on this one. Yep. And as you drink this, again, it's still relatively light and fruity on the palate. You're going to get a little almost a plummy bite as you exhale through your nose. Okay. And I call it a ninja beer because you can sit and drink this and say, oh, isn't this nice? And the next thing you know, you get up to go to the loo and your knees are wobbly. So you got to be careful with this one a bit because it'll sneak up on you. We've done a nice little run through on Weizen beer. To my knowledge, we're the only ones in the U.S. that are making the original style regular. I mean, there may be some others. I haven't run into any, and I try Weiss beer wherever I go. It's a tough job. But the other styles you will see out and about, we always have at least 3 Weiss beers on at any time. So we've always got the original, the modern, and the Dunkelweizen at any time. And the Weizenbock is a seasonal. We have barrel-aged this a couple of times, which is really kind of cool. Most of the barrel-aged beers that you run into are imperial stouts, which has a certain character to it. Lots of vanilla and tannin. And this one's kind of interesting if you put this in the barrel because it actually comes out with some of these fruity characteristics to offset the bourbon. You get a lot of bourbon aroma, and the body to it is a little different. So if you ever see that on tap on our social media, make sure you hustle in and try it because we never have very much. Any questions on wheat beer? Feedback on wheat beer? Has everybody tried wheat beer before?
Yeah.
Okay.
On average, how many different styles of wheat beer are you brewing a year?
4 or 5 generally in a given year. We've done some derivatives off of this too. We've also made some American style wheats. We do a Vit, which is a Belgian wheat beer. Your American versions of that are things like Blue Moon. Oberon, another K College, that is an American style wheat. And I don't know. I've never asked Larry, but I'm guessing that if he was an exchange student early on as a home brewer, he was trying to make Weiss beer. But with the equipment and not being able to get a heavy wheat mash through, it probably toned it down, so it's a lesser percentage of wheat, and he had to use the yeast he had and made a great beer. Just it's not really a Bavarian Weiss beer when you talk about that. And Belgian style Vit beers, that was a dead style too that was recreated by Pierre Celis in the 1960s, but that's, they say, Blue Moon and Hoegaarden, and Hoegaarden was his brand originally. Shock Top's another one by Anheuser-Busch. And those have orange peel and coriander in them. So those are spiced. And that's the only beer we make that has more than 4 ingredients. But that is a seasonal, and we do produce that on some summers. Anything else on wheat beer, and we'll move on?
I'm just curious as to how you offer these only here on tap, or?
We do. We have some out there prior to COVID. We had about 80 bars and restaurants that were serving our beer on tap. Primarily in the West Michigan area. We don't really go east very far. We go as far north as Charlevoix and Traverse City. And we had a couple places in Kalamazoo that had us at times. And along the lake shore, and certainly here in Kent County. We had the vast majority of them were here in Kent County. So you do see that out. Due to COVID and trying to catch up, we've kind of pared that down a little bit. We have a handful that have been consistent with us that we've kept. And we also packaged for the first time during COVID. We did do 4 beers in cans on a one-time only basis on a borrowed canner that we just sold over the bar. We basically had a bunch of beer sitting here that we had no place to go because suddenly the world ended and there was no place for beer to go. So it was distill it or put it in cans, and the cans were nice. And actually it turned out relatively well, and our plan was down the road to offer cans, but we may move that up a little bit. So it actually went pretty well having the package out there. So All right, guys. So we've kind of reset the decks here a little bit, and we're going to change directions entirely. As I kind of mentioned earlier in the story of Weiss beer, that was for a long time the most popular style out there. And because nobody else could make Weiss beer, the most popular style, they had to do whatever they could to innovate and create something that would sell. As I mentioned, the history of Munich is really dark and heavy beers, a lot of times very murky. And a lot of guys, specifically Josef Zedelmeier was one of the big ones from Spaten Brewery, but they started borrowing technology from around the globe. The English had really developed some pale malting techniques that they could make some lighter malts. And when I'm talking of that, that's really due to kilning. It's kind of like putting bread in a toaster, is where your color of beer comes from. Put it in for a little while, you get a light one. A little while longer, you're red or brown. And you put it in for a lot longer, you'll get dark or roasted ones. And people associate the dark ones a lot of times with coffee. It's actually the roasting of the coffee bean that you're getting. Coffee bean raw is green. But when you roast it, you get those roasty, toasty flavors. And the same thing is true with beer. So as you kiln the malts, you can dial that in to kind of get the resulting color of the product that you want. And the brewers will a lot of times will mix and match different malts to create the color and the appearance that they want. But eventually they started to create lighter and lager beers. And lager beer is based on yeast. The German word for to store is lager. And these beers tended to be a little crisper and cleaner, and they were a little easier to drink and started to become more popular. Weiss beer, as I mentioned, kind of faded away until the 60s, and suddenly, beginning in the early 19th century, when it was really isolated, the yeast was starting to be isolated, they were able to create consistent lager beers. And then once mechanical refrigeration came around and brewing was no longer seasonal, before that, by law, part of the Reinheitsgebot, you could only brew from the fall through to the spring. And we're going to talk about that with Märzen in a second. But in the summertime, you couldn't brew. They knew that they got funky flavors. What it was they were getting other yeasts that were active. The lager yeast tend to work better at colder temperatures and over a longer period of time. So the most popular beer in Munich nowadays is Helles or Edelhell. Now, Hell is the German word for light or pale. And this is really the ubiquitous beer that you see absolutely everywhere. Every brewery makes it. And this is really just a light, drinkable beer. It was actually the Munich answer to Pilsner, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But because of the hard water in Munich, it was also very, very difficult to make light beer. And again, the Dreyer family from Spaten, they invented a technique in 1894-95, and they were really the first ones to be able to make a nice pale lager in Munich, the style that ended up kind of taking over the market in the city. So when you try this one, we can go through the same exercise. Slightly different glass. I mean, even when you smell this one, this is going to smell like beer, right? Take a little sip of that. Very lightly hopped. There's just a little bite that's going to give you some cleanliness to this. But this is just a very clean, light drinking, easy beer. When you go to the beer halls in Munich, the Hofbräuhaus is the one that everybody thinks of, and they have the great big steins. When you guys were on foreign study at K, how many of you went to the Hofbräuhaus? So, where did you go? You went to Budapest. Okay. You didn't go to the Hofbräuhaus? Okay, all right. But you know what I'm talking about. So you have those great big mugs of beer. This was all Helles. That's what they were all drinking. And this is really the mass beer of Munich. So this one's nice, clean, easy. This is a seasonal for us, but it's just a nice, clean, easy drinking beer. This might be what I have on tap right now. I'm sorry?
So you said it's a seasonal beer. What's the season that you have this?
Well, for us, because of space, lager takes a long time. The only two that we produce year-round are the Pilsner and the Märzen, which we're going to get to here in a second. And all the rest of these are seasonal. We generally try to do this one in the summertime. This year, of course, COVID has kind of screwed things up a little bit, which we're going to talk about when we get to the Maibach. But we do try to do this one in the summer. But it's kind of an every other year beer for us. So, yeah, 5%. Yep, 5%. And if you'll excuse my French, I drink the shit out of this beer. This is just one of those that you can just, goes down easy. So, As I said, this was the Munich answer to Pils. Now, Pilsner is based on the town of Pilsen, and Pilsner Urquell is the only beer that most brewers still call Pilsner. Unless you're Miller Lite, you throw out an ad and say so. But Pilsner was named for the town, and this was really 1842. They had a beer riot in that city, where the town citizens raided the brewery because the beer sucked, and they dumped a bunch of kegs in the street and just fussed and protested. Gosh darn it, our beer sucks. We can do better. So they built a new brewery. They commissioned a local Czech architect, and they went and got a German brewmaster, a 24-year-old by the name of Josef Kroll, who by most accounts was an asshole. But he showed up in Pilsen. They kind of worked together, did a little research, and this is really, I kind of like to call the world's first international collaboration beer. Because again, they borrowed some of the lager yeast that Kroll brought from Bavaria. They traveled to England and again researched pale malting techniques from England to make a very, very pale malt. And they used the local Saaz hops, okay? And they created this beer, which turned out to be almost an immediate overnight sensation. October 5th, 1842, if I maybe, don't quote me on that, it won't be on the quiz, but I'm pretty sure that's the date it was released, and it was just bam. It coincided with a couple of things. Railroad cars were traveling all over Europe. Travel was suddenly a little bit easier, and glass was affordable and within reach for most normal people. But prior to that, people used stoneware or wooden vessels to drink in, and suddenly you had a beer that was bright and you could totally see through. This had really never happened before, and it was an immediate overnight sensation, and you may have noticed that this style eventually took over the damn world. Basically, every beer you've ever heard of that was a commercial beer that we all grew up with, except for maybe Guinness, was based on this style of beer. All the American light lager all around the world. If you go to if you were in the South America on vacation at some point, you might have had a Bavaria or one of these. They're all based on Corona. Any Asian beers, all really based on this style of beer. Okay, they have very, very soft water in Pilsen. And really, if you drink the Pilsner Urquell style, it's very, very light and very, very herbal. With this, you're going to notice a little bit more of a hop bite than you had in the Helles, okay? Especially as you exhale, you're going to get a little bit more dryness. Ours is kind of based on the České Budějovice version, which you may have heard as the Czech Budweiser. Okay, that was located a little bit south of Pilsen, and they made a version of the Czech Pilsner lager, but they call it Pils. They don't call it Pilsner. Pilsner is reserved for, by an honor system, reserved for the Pilsner Urquell brewery. So if you see a lot of German Pilsners, they're either named Pils or they're named Pilsener. You have the other E stuck in there. Otherwise, nobody uses the term Pilsner. Just like I said, out of an honor thing for them. So it's malty, bready, but you have a little bit of that clean, hoppy bite to it. Okay? This one tastes kind of familiar?
Yeah, so good.
All right. Now, Kuster Export. So this will be the third one you have in line. And again, you notice all these are relatively, they're going to be nuanced. The differences in these are somewhat nuanced. Dortmund was in the north. It was not a Bavarian region. And we're going to talk about Märzen here next. But Märzen was a style of beer invented prior to Pils, but ended up becoming very popular, and it was sourced both in Munich and in Vienna, the Vienna style called Vienna. And Dortmund, Bavaria is Catholic, and all the breweries that grew up there and the world's oldest breweries are all based in monasteries. All these breweries that you may have heard of, Weinstephaner or Weltenberg, that are literally 1,000 years old, these were all monastery breweries. During the Dark Ages, after the fall of Rome, it was the church that was able to keep basically knowledge alive, and they could read and write and didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from. They could brew beer, and they passed this technology down and ended up really keeping the brewing arts alive for centuries. The North was Lutheran after the Reformation and Protestant, and the North really was built on trades and guilds. And so it was a little different system up there, and their beers evolved somewhat differently. But the Dortmunder export was the Dortmund answer, the northern answer to the Märzen that we're going to talk about next, okay? Chronologically, we're a little out of order, but we're doing this in flavor profile.
So there's a better time to answer this, let me know. But when I was there, I lived in Münster, in
Yep.
Westphalia.
Yep.
And we drank a lot of alt beer. And I
Yep.
didn't put a lot of thought into what
Right.
I was drinking. I just drank it, right?
Yeah. So if you remember your German, what does alt stand for? Old. Old. It was old beer. At the time that alt beer started to became popular in that specific region. Now we're not going to have an alt beer in the tasting today, but alt beer was old beer. It was an ale. They used older yeast, the ale style yeast versus lager that everything else was around it. The Weissbier is still an ale. Alt beer was an ale. Kolsch is an ale, which was very near there from Cologne, the Cologne region. But virtually everything else that was and Berliner Weiss was an ale, but virtually everything else that was famous as a German style were all lager beers. Yep. So Dab, if you were in that area, D-A-B, do you remember that one? That's kind of the most famous Dortmunder style beer. But now a lot of other even Bavarian breweries make it. One of my favorite lagers there is one that's called Augustiner Edelstoff, which is their version of export. But this is a little bit stronger. It's export strength, so it's made to travel. Alcohol helps as a preservative. So this is about a 6% beer, but it's a little more generously hopped. So it's going to have a hop profile similar to the Pilsner, but a little more kick and a little more body than the Helles.
David, are all these beers typically drank in the taller style glass like that you have a beer?
Beer glasses. We could do a couple hours just on that. I hate the American shaker pint. It's a terrible vessel for beer. You get no head. There's no head space in it. You don't get the aromas. It opens totally up at the top, and most bartenders will pour, and there's very little foam. But you'll notice if you travel in Europe, almost every beer has its own distinct style of glass. This is a small version. We use this as a sampler, but it's a small version of a lager glass or a Helles, or we call it a Willi. Export will usually be in that or a Stein. Typically, the tall Weissbier glasses, which you saw in the images we had earlier, wheat beer is almost always served in those. And then there's other styles will end up in different beers. We're actually changing our Pilsner glassware shortly to be more of an authentic Pilsner glass, but we serve all of our lagers in this style of glass. Yep. So Märzen, chronologically, this is actually the older style of beer, and I think mine are somewhat out of order. Märzen, the German word for March is März. So this was traditionally brewed at the end of the brewing season before refrigeration. And it was brewed in March, and it was stored in caves or underground to lager over the summer months, and then it was released as a fall or a harvest beer. The gentleman we talked about earlier, Josef Zedelmeier, he was working with a guy out of Vienna by the name of Anton Dreher, and they both traveled to England, pale malting technology. They were able to make somewhat lighter malt, and they had isolated the lager yeast, and they started making this beer then to condition over the summer and then release it as a fall harvest beer. 1904, 1905, somewhere in that area as this started to evolve. Not coincidentally, does anybody know how Oktoberfest started? Anybody know what that was originally? Oktoberfest was a wedding. That's exactly right. King Ludwig I and Princess Theresia were married on October 12th of 1810, and they threw a big party, and the Bavarians, the Munich folk, had so much time that they decided to do that every year. And it became a big party, and they did it on an ongoing basis, and at horse races and rides, etc. And of course, it's Bavaria, so that means beer was involved. And they started to serve beer, of course, with this. Now, legally, anything that's served at Oktoberfest is technically called Oktoberfest. But by the 1870s, this Märzen style of beer, because it was often released in the fall, really became associated. When people talk about Oktoberfest beer, they're talking about Märzen. So this is the style traditionally that they're talking about. If you sip on this a little bit, go through our exercise again. Now, as opposed to the other ones that we have, This is going to have just a little bit more of a caramely sweet nose to it. Again, it's subtle, but kind of a little light sweetness. There's a little body there, okay? This is also 6.2%, so it's a little bit stronger, okay? But it's got a little bit of caramely sweetness to it. Yeah, everybody getting that? So it was associated with Oktoberfest, and this lasted for really basically a century. In the 1970s, another brewery, Paulaner, introduced Fest beer, which was a little lighter version, a little heavier than a Helles, a little lighter than a Märzen, and it was obviously a little cheaper for them to produce, a little lower alcohol, and that really is kind of taken over now. That's what's served on the Wiesen, which is a Bavarian contraction for the word meadow, and Oktoberfest is held on Theresa's Meadow is the location. So a German or a Bavarian, a Munich person will never say Oktoberfest. They always say Wiesen. Are you going to the Wiesen? So that's where it's held, and you'll know right away if you're a tourist because you call it Oktoberfest. So, but this style, traditionally in terms of style-wise, when people talk about Oktoberfest beer, this is what they're talking about. Okay. Now, anybody that can't sell beer in Oktoberfest is reserved for the big six. The 6 big breweries in Munich are Spaten, Löwenbräu, Hacker-Schorr, Paulaner, Augustiner, and Hofbräu. Okay? As I mentioned, 4 of them are now owned by big guys. Augustiner is still locally owned, and most of the Munich people will tell you that's their favorite beer. And Hofbräu is actually owned by the state of Bavaria. Again, this would be akin to Michigan having its own brewery, which is a darn fine idea if you ask me. And they're the ones that own the Hofbräu House, and they have some locations now as a chain around the United States. There's one in Chicago, there's one in Milwaukee, there's one in Pittsburgh, there's a few of them around. There's one in Vegas. The nicest one is in Vegas. That one has the best food. But they're the only 6 that are allowed to be at Oktoberfest, and of course they're very protective of the rights to do that. But any of the other breweries that can't make Oktoberfest beer because they're not served there, they call it Fest beer. So you're going to get a lot of the imports again. Eyenger's one that a lot of people like that is imported, but they call it a Fest beer, and it's their version of Oktoberfest. So, okay? Makes sense? Any questions on that? All righty. Then the final one we're going to, everybody have their 5th one? The 5th one show up yet? Okay. This is where we're going to get out of season because gosh darn COVID. This was actually a springtime release as we do our seasonals, right? Einbeck, as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about Bock beer. Einbeck was really the first place in the north to create a Bock style beer. And in the south, of course, they had to answer that, so they developed Maibock. And a lot of these are very open to interpretation. Bock is just going to be a strong lager. But this is traditionally released in May. Now here in Cedar Springs, we don't really do an Oktoberfest because we have a Red Flannel Festival here in town, which is a big city festival that's been going on for 80-something years. So we kind of work with them and do a festival with them, but we don't really do an Oktoberfest because it would be kind of counterproductive to do that at the same time. So instead we do what's called Starkbierfest in the spring, and that literally is Strong Beer Festival. So we always release 2 to 3 Bock beers in the spring, and it rotates every single year. And for some of you that are local, I know a couple of you have been to this before, and it's usually a darn tootin' good time. We all wear our lederhosen and we drink we have a couple of pops and we make merry, and we have live music in a big beer tent outside. And there's much rejoicing. It's quite amusing. But anyway, this was all set to release this year, but wouldn't you know it, the world ended and we had our COVID thing. I was actually in Munich when COVID broke out in Italy with our chef working in a kitchen, so we had to hustle back, go on quarantine, and start canceling things left and right and taking tables out of here and telling people no, they can't show up. But this thing, as it's a lager, it's stored fairly well, so we didn't really release this then until halfway through the summer. So we're totally out of season, don't hold it against me. But this one you'll notice if you go through the same exercise again, you're going to get just a little more body on this. This is actually a 7.5% beer, so there's a little more kick to this one. And this is going to have a bigger malty bite to it, and you're going to get a little bit more kind of toffee, maybe a touch of molasses on top of this, heavier again than the Märzen that we had tasted last. Okay. Now seasonally, we're still, a lot of these are summer style beers, hence they're all a little bit lighter. Next week we have a Rauchbier coming out, which is an old style of beer. an old style of lager, and that's using smoked malt. So it's kind of like bacon in a glass for those of you. It's not just for breakfast anymore, but if you pop back in the next couple of weeks, you'll be able to try that. And then in the wintertime, we get into a Munich Dunkel, which is a style that made Munich famous. See, I think they stole that ad in Milwaukee. That's not true. And that's a darker brown lager. And then often in the wintertime, we have Schwarzbier as well, which is a black lager. And that's really one of the world's oldest beer styles. That recipe tradition goes back almost 800 years. So there's always a little something that changes up in the lager lineup. So if you ever pop back again in a few months, you probably get a chance to try some things new. So, okay. As I kind of mentioned earlier, you know, our goal here was to kind of reproduce and recreate a German tradition to really replicate the culture that I fell in love with as part of my exchange program at Kalamazoo College. That gave us, a lot of us who went there, an opportunity to travel and see things that we otherwise likely never would have done. And it made me move back, and as I said, my goal was really to come back here to Bland Rapids and share a little bit of that culture that I'd fallen in love with all of my closest friends and relatives. As you may have heard as well, in this past week there was a thing on Wood TV. We announced last year that we were opening another tap room in downtown Grand Rapids, the Kusterer Brauhaus, which will be a little different concept than what's here, but wouldn't you know it, it's also German. So that'll be probably even a little bit more so, but we had to hit the brake pedals due to COVID as well. But we're hoping to get that started, and I would say early 2021, hopefully, that we can get the doors open on that thing. And for some of you who maybe traveled a little bit today, it'll be a little closer to stop by and bend an elbow and make a new friend or two. So, Dankeschön. And if anybody has questions, like I said, we can mill about and talk a little bit. But otherwise, for those of you watching online, thanks for stopping by, and go Hornets.